Thanks to Continuity Insights for having us here today. I'm excited to be joined today by two meteorologists covering both the northern and southern regions of the United States, along with Alert Media's very own emergency communication expert, Peter Steinfeld. Paul and Jason, it would be great if you guys could kick us off by just introducing yourselves. Paul, why don't I hand it over to you to go first?
Sure, thanks, Alex. Name is Paul Ura. I work with the National Weather Service office in the Austin, San Antonio, Texas office. So obviously I'm used to more of a warmth of a winter, not very cold, but I'll give you my perspective as we go on through today about what we usually get here in the I'll call us the deep South. But my interest in weather came to me very, very young, talking about like 8, 9 years old, and was able to kind of go to school, get my degree in meteorology. And then the only place I've ever worked professionally has been the National Weather Service. So I've been in almost 28 years now, and started out in Oklahoma and in Austin, where I was when I was going to school. Full-time job down in Brownsville, Texas, South Carolina, Charleston, South Carolina, and then back here to the Austin, San Antonio area, where I'm now what they call the warning coordination meteorologist. I'm a liaison officer in between different agencies, the general public, and of course our National Weather Service agency like that. And then when I was at school, I met this amazing meteorologist, Jason Franklin. And so we've known each other for now about what, 28, 30 years or something like that. So we're excited to kind of finally be able to work together.
That's awesome. Jason, can you tell us a little bit about the area that you cover?
Sure. I currently work at the Philadelphia National Weather Service forecast office. Philadelphia's been in the news a lot lately, so everyone's pretty familiar with this area here. But we're up north. Definitely, the weather is in the wintertime a little different than it is down in the deep south, as Paul says. But I grew up in upstate New York in a town called near Binghamton, New York, and we get all kinds of winter weather up there. We've had snowstorms, blizzards in April, right around Easter. We've also had very warm weather, as today it is record highs here in this part of the world for November. But I've been in the Weather Service for 29 years and seen a lot of things, from blizzards to tornadoes, hurricanes, even had an earthquake in Washington, D.C. I don't know if that really is weather, but when I was working there in Washington as part of in my career circle, we had the experience of having a 5.8 earthquake through Washington, D.C. But I worked in many different cities, like Paul has, from Albany, New York, to Boston, Long Island, Washington, D.C., Charleston, West Virginia, Buffalo, New York, Raleigh, North Carolina. That's my southern end right there, and then back up here to the Philadelphia area, southern New Jersey. Paul and I met, as Paul said, when we were in grad school there at the University of Oklahoma, but I also did undergraduate work up here at the State University of New York in Albany. Weather has been a passion of mine, just like Paul's, for since we were kids, and it's just really great to have this opportunity to do something that we really enjoy.
Thanks, Jason. We're happy to have both of you here today. And then last but not least, Peter Steinfeld with Alert Media. Peter, can you just tell the audience a little bit about your area of expertise?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm the Senior Vice President of Safety Solutions and Sales at Alert Media, and I started in emergency communications, specifically in the disaster recovery and business continuity industry back in 2001. And I've experienced many emergencies over the years, either directly or a lot of times through the eyes of my clients, and have come to find that really nothing ever goes 100% according to plan when disaster strikes, and that's why communication becomes so vital. And with that in mind, Alert Media does help organizations keep their people safe and informed through our easy-to-use, cloud-based, two-way, multi-channel mass notification system. And towards the end of this, if there's interest in learning more, certainly let us know. But today the focus is winter weather.
Thanks, Peter. So yes, as Peter said, today the focus is about winter weather. Today's event, we don't have that many slides. We have a couple in the beginning to kick things off, but mostly this is meant to be a conversation. So as all of you know that registered, we did ask questions of the audience to submit ahead of time. So we have a lot of those prepared and ready to answer for you today. But if you do have additional questions, please feel free to type them into the Q&A, and we'll try to get as many as we can throughout today's session. So we'd love to kick things off with a poll. Just to have a better understanding of the audience today, we'd like to understand which of the following are you concerned will impact your people and organization this winter. And you can select all that apply here. And Peter, Paul, and Jason, I don't know if you are hearing from certain people what they're worried about this winter season. Obviously, COVID-19 is something that is changing how we're approaching winter and is the reason we're all here today having this conversation. But I don't know if there's anything else that you're hearing about from clients that you deal with.
Yeah, I think it's basically all of the above, but on top of that is this whole unknown of COVID-19 and how's that going to change things that I normally think about or I'm concerned about.
Yep.
Yeah, and especially
Okay.
even from us, like even today, the city of Austin, there's a winter planning meeting, basically going over the typical winter plan that they have. So yes, in the middle of all the COVID and everything that the city and counties are doing, they still have to plan for the typical winter weather and what's going to happen if there's a sleet storm, ice storm, sheltering, all of that. So, life goes on. The winter and the weather are not going to stop just because we have COVID right now. So we all have to be prepared for that.
Absolutely. All right. It looks like the results are in. Over 75% voted, and 95%, no surprise there, are worried about COVID-19 and general illness. 64% cold temperatures, 55% dangerous driving, and then 45% school closings and 22% seasonal affective disorder. Any surprises there to any of you?
Not to me. That seems about right.
Okay. Right. I know a lot of people in the South are probably wondering when winter is going to start. It's, like Jason said, it's in the 70s there on the East Coast. It's 80 here today. So definitely, I think, people are wondering if they can open up their swimming pools still. But winter will come. I can guarantee you that. It just depends on the timing, I guess.
Absolutely. So Dawn, I'd love if you could pull up the slide that we prepared. Paul and Jason, I was hoping you could spend just a bit of time talking about the forecast for this winter that your organization has put out. And then after that, Peter, we'll talk about how this season is different due to the pandemic.
Sure. So I'll go first. I'll talk primarily about the southern part of the United States, and then Jason can take over with the cold regions of the United States. But as you can see, so, it becomes quite complicated why, Jason and I are meteorologists. We tend to really kind of focus our science on, I would say, the next 7 days, the next week of weather. There's a whole other science in the background that goes along with us, and it's basically called climatology. These are scientists, climatologists that look at the trends of what the weather will be doing from now for longer periods. And particularly, this is what they do. They will put out these seasonal outlooks, basically season forecasts, to give us some sort of guidance as to, what are we expecting? Colder than average, warmer than average, wetter, drier, all of that. And, I guess the one little asterisk I'll kind of put on this is, even though we think the overall pattern will be something like, for us across the southern half of the United States, warmer than average, that doesn't mean that we're not going to have a big Arctic outbreak. That doesn't mean that we're not going to get a big snowstorm. Individual weather events are individual weather events, and they sometimes happen in a longer and bigger process of what a whole season will be, above average or below average. So with that, when you look at the maps, you kind of see on the left-hand side there, you're talking about temperatures, and obviously across the whole southern half of the United States, they're expecting it to be warmer than average across the entire winter season. And then with that is going to be then some drier. And the problem with that right now across the whole southern half of the United States is that especially a lot of the West and the South, we're actually in a drought right now. And so as we don't get a lot of rain, and as the temperatures are expected to be warmer than average, that'll add just to a lot of other issues. Increased drought, increased fire issues that we've already had. You've seen all the big stories about out of California and the West and everything else. So primarily, and the key phrase here is, warmer and drier than average. Again, doesn't mean we can't have some big flash flood, or it doesn't mean we can't have a big cold outbreak. Just overall for the South, that's what we're expecting.
So from the northern side of things, we're not looking at a warm and dry pattern, but in this outlook, we're looking at more of a cooler and wetter pattern up in the northern areas, and especially from the Great Lakes westward along the U.S.-Canadian border out to the Pacific Northwest. Here in the Northeast, we're in a pattern called the La Nina pattern, and that's where the equatorial Pacific waters on this side of the Pacific tend to be cooler than average during these next few months. And in the La Nina pattern, the Northeast, the signals and the results don't necessarily, they're kind of mixed when it comes to warm, cold versus, and then wet versus dry. So what you can see here by these maps is you don't see those higher probabilities of like what Paul said with the warmer and drier possibilities coming up here this winter down in the South, and you see those darker reds and those darker browns. Those mean an increased likelihood of those things happening over the average of the season. But here in the Northeast and the northern states, you don't see those higher probabilities because there is a lot of variability when it comes to a La Nina pattern, and there's a lot of other outside influences that come into play. So yeah, in the Northeast, the map shows us in an orange, which means a little warmer than normal, but there could be several Arctic outbreaks that come across the Great Lakes, and so that keeps things cooler. It gives a lot of lake effect snows downwind of the Great Lakes, but overall it can be a warmer period. Same thing with the precipitation outlook. Actually, it's a toss-up. If you see that it's a white color in the Northeast, and it's pretty much anybody's game as to whether or not it's going to be wetter or drier. And that's just because of the history of what we've known about the La Nina pattern, is that other than in the Great Lakes or points to the west there along the U.S.-Canadian border, it's really up to other forces that come into play other than what we're looking at here with La Nina. So there have been winters where it's been very dry during the La Nina pattern here in the Northeast, and we've had major snowstorms where there's been above average amount of precipitation. So it's tough to say, but currently, given how warm it is here in November, we're tending toward it being a warmer and maybe not as wet of a winter here in the Northeast, but points to the west of us, it looks like it'll be on the cooler side and perhaps a little wetter or whiter.
Thanks, Jason. We are being reminded in the chat, though, that Southern California was near freezing temperatures. So we have quite a few people on that want to remind us.
People always tend to correct the meteorologist wherever we are.
Yes.
So yes, I totally.
Peter, it'd be great before we get into our questions, if you could just spend a few minutes setting the stage and talking about why we should all be thinking differently as we approach this winter. And Dawn, we have one more slide here if you want to progress forward that we can show that sort of lists out some of these differences.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say, unlike more normal times, COVID-19 is certainly going to add a layer of complexity to the standard set of winter weather challenges. And I think it falls into 4 general categories here. First and foremost, a lot of people are working from home, and that means the number of potential points of failure have increased significantly. Your ability to do things like service clients, work on a project, or even run payroll are now dependent sometimes on your employees' home internet and power. So think about this and what you'll do if key individuals are unable to get their work done. You might need to have more on-prem temporary work areas to accommodate this kind of stuff. So just think about how you'll handle that. And then second, you can probably count on a continued uptick in the number of COVID-19 infections. I clearly just saw that on the news right before I joined this webinar. It's only natural with people spending a whole lot more time indoors close to one another. And any organization that requires people to be on site will have to have, I would say, very highly capable and efficient screening procedures. And then if someone's infected, be prepared to sustain the impact associated with their absence and potentially the shutdown of a location. And then third, generally speaking, the population as a whole, I would say, tends to experience more sickness just overall in the winter, not COVID-19 specific. I mean, who knows how bad the flu is going to hit this season. People also tend to get very stressed out during the holiday season, and the uncertainties around COVID-19 are likely going to amplify those issues. So absolutely keep an eye on employees' mental health. And I think we got some questions about that we'll address later. And then last point you see on the screen here, I think there's a good chance that more kids are going to be spending time at home, either because they got COVID-19 or they were potentially exposed and they're sent home. So this will be on top of all the normal winter school challenges and delayed starts and closures due to inclement weather. So organizations, I think, need to understand that and should be ready to accommodate these last minute impacts to employee availability. So plan ahead, knowing it's going to happen so you don't get caught unprepared.
Thanks, Peter. Okay, I think it's time for us to jump into some of our audience submitted questions. And as I said in the beginning, we've had quite a few that came in before, but please feel free to chime in the chat or in the Q&A section of the GoToWebinar, and we'll try to get to as many questions as we can today. So our first question that was submitted by one of our audience members is, what are some of the best practices for keeping track of evolving winter weather conditions? Maybe Peter, you can kick us off by talking about what you see working with businesses across our customer base, and then maybe Paul and Jason, you can chime in as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll give the biased answer. I'm very biased here, clearly working for Alert Media, but we offer a service that does precisely this. So you're able to map out your people on a map and then put weather overlay on there. So I think the value there is you don't just see weather, you don't just see your people, you put two and two together, which helps you understand, yeah, there's a lot of stuff going out there, but I don't care unless it's specifically impacting my folks. So whether you get it from us or somebody else, see if you can find a solution that does that, puts two and two together, because that'll help you understand, are there any things going on out there that are going to impact my folks? Now, that's the biased answer. I know there's tons of other places you can go to get great info on weather. So I don't know, Paul or Jason, who wants to step in first?
The key phrase or the key word that I see is evolving, and that is the term to use when it comes to weather, because weather changes all the time. The forecast changes all the time. So one best practice I'd like to mention is just the frequency of which you need to be checking for the weather forecast, because that's going to be huge, especially in winter weather scenarios where you check the forecast and yesterday we were expecting 1 to 2 inches of snow. Well, by this afternoon's forecast, maybe something changed in the weather models, and all of a sudden the local weather service forecasters are now forecasting 6 to 12 inches, where before it was not going to be much of an impact, and now all of a sudden it is. So how fast the forecast changes sometimes is extraordinary, where one shift to the next, 1 hour by 1 hour. The conditions, a cold front just came through here today. So, a cold front can move faster, slower. A storm system can be more ramped up than what it was yesterday. So to me, that's just one of the keys, is that you have to frequently check the forecast because it is evolving all the time.
And in this age of, misinformation or information that employees are getting from social media, where do you recommend that people look to get their information about weather?
Well, of course, I'm biased toward the National Weather Service.
Right.
But there's a lot of firms out there. There's a lot of private meteorologist firms out there too that specifically deal with businesses. You have to think of the National Weather Service, 30,000 foot level. We're forecasting for the entire United States, counties and cities. But a lot of businesses, many businesses, have very specific criteria and threats that private meteorologists and private meteorologist companies then can give them that very specific forecasting. So we work hand in hand with, everybody's trying to get out the best forecast to everybody. And a lot of times that means the equipment that the National Weather Service has and the models and everything else, but then all these other private meteorology firms as well, utilizing that information and forecasting specifically for businesses.
Yeah. What are some of the things that the National Weather Service can provide to people? Like what could a business expect if they wanted to contact you guys?
Well, especially so like even things we're doing today. So a lot of outreach materials, even if it's winter safety talks, any sort of weather safety talks, we will very often do that to different businesses and everything. And again, since we're more on the 30,000 foot level, of course our watches and warnings kind of go out to everybody in the entire world, not specifically just to a certain business or a certain county or city. It goes out to everybody. So we offer the same service basically to everybody that we do that. And so yeah, of course our website is free. It's 24/7. You can just click on the website and get the latest watches and warnings and forecast information as well.
Thanks, Paul. There's a couple questions here about communication. So before we kick those off and talk about communication, I'm just going to launch another poll. Communication is obviously a critical piece to keeping your employees informed and helping them understand what to expect from your business. So which of these channels are you currently using to communicate with your employees during emergencies, during severe weather events?
Yeah, I'll be curious to see what comes back here. Usually email's number one, because it seems like in most organizations, just about everyone has email and it's fairly easy to send those out. But text often is a close second, but unless you have some kind of text blasting solution, it's hard to text a lot of people at once.
Right. Or obviously, if you have an emergency communication system, then you could be using multiple channels. And
Yeah.
it looks like some of the progress coming in here that people are using a multi-channel approach, which is great.
That is great. That's really the goal, is you never know what channel someone is going to pay attention to in an emergency. So send many messages to different channels all at once.
Yep.
Hey, Jason, when we don't deal with obviously the winter weather a lot down here in my neck of the woods, but there for your office, I mean, how do you keep track of like what people are going to be able to even make it to work? Like if the roads are so bad, you guys just do like quick texting back and forth, or what do you guys do?
As far as within our office, or yeah,
the employees of your office there.
Yeah, we use a lot of text messages. Actually, my staff are in communication platforms that they all communicate with one another, and myself, we have text messages that I can just send a blast, text message to everybody if I needed to. We use email, or we could just go through the phone tree, but it's pretty much in line with what you see on the quick poll here as far as how we communicate if we were to run into a situation like that.
Right.
Great. So you can see the results here, right, Peter and Paul and Jason?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Excellent. Yeah, I think no surprise here. Good to see that people are using a multi-channel approach. That's awesome. Okay, so kicking off some of those questions that came in about communication, how far in advance of a major storm should employers be communicating with their employees? And I don't know, Peter, if you want to kick us off there, and then we can ask for Jason and Paul's opinion as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what we see among our clients, best practice is, I would say, 2 words: early and often. I would say you don't want to scare people unnecessarily, but advanced warning is always a good thing. It basically gets people in the right frame of mind, and they start thinking about the quote unquote what ifs. What if the kids can't go to school? What if I lose power or internet? Can I still do my job? Things like that are especially more impactful, seeing that a lot of people are working from home. So using an informational intranet site or something like what we offer, the Alert Media event pages, I think they can provide people with a consistent resource for the latest information on a situation, so you don't have to have them wait to get that next push notification. So do kind of a combination, push messages out to people, and then have like a resource they can visit at their own leisure. And then I would say, again, communicate early and often.
Thanks, Peter. Paul, do you have anything to add there, maybe?
Yeah, and just like even within the National Weather Service, we depending on the confidence level, obviously we deal a lot with percentages and how confident we actually are with something. You can take a major storm system that the models are all nailing, they're all like, okay, this is really going to be kind of happening, and then it's just kind of tweaking some numbers. That messaging may go out much sooner than maybe this kind of wishy-washy, kind of possible snow, one of those sort of situations. And so a lot of our messaging then goes with our confidence level. And you can usually kind of read into our messaging as to how confident we are. There is no what ifs. Well, we maybe think we use a lot more definite sort of wording when our confidence level kind of goes up. But then again, it also just totally depends on your location in the United States and how much time these businesses need to actually be prepared. If we're down here in this part of the world and in this part of the United States, like in Texas, where we don't have salt trucks a lot, we don't have snow plows, the preparedness time is much longer just because we don't even have the equipment to even prepare, like, let's say, the roads, except for some brine solution that like our Department of Highways puts down. So a lot will kind of depend on what the businesses are used to and how much time they need to spin up on those sort of situations.
Absolutely. And then follow-up question here from the audience. Do you feel that people think it is redundant hearing from work when they can see the local news?
That's an interesting question, and we've looked into this before, and you would think that people would just watch the news via the internet, TV, radio, and they would believe what they hear. But actually, studies show that people actually believe their employers more than they do the local news. I think it's because it ties back to someone they trust and they see every day. And frankly, does the weather really matter unless it has some impact on you? And that impact could be, can I go to work or not? So somehow tying those two things together, my employer, can I work, the weather, it makes them look to you for what do I need to do? And I always come back to saying that in any kind of emergency situation, no matter how drastic or how minimal, there's confusion. And if you can get ahead of that confusion, you help reduce people's anxiety, and then you can improve productivity. So yeah, I think it's important the employer plays a role in that to reduce the anxiety and confusion that's out there just by communicating with people.
And Peter, is it with everyone with quite a bit of the workforce working remote right now, it's not just about the physical office space, right? It's also about this duty of care for the employer to warn their people of a pending weather event, right? And provide that extra value. Are you seeing that across the businesses that we work with?
Absolutely. There's this increased concept of this legal and moral responsibility for duty of care, that anytime you have people that rely on you, they're essentially in your care and you have a duty to provide them care. And that includes making sure they don't put themselves in harmful situations, either on premise at your facility, or let's say they're driving to work. I remember a hurricane a couple of years ago where they're now a customer of ours, but before they didn't have a system in place, and they had a lot of people that did not speak English as a first language, or pretty much at all, and they just didn't reach out to these folks. And some of them were, lower paid or not lower paid, but just not highly paid individuals, and they really needed to go to work to earn that paycheck. And there was a massive hurricane going on, and they tried to drive to work even though they shouldn't have. But because there was no clear communication, you had some people that no one got hurt, or killed, but they lost automobiles getting flooded out and things like that. So if you just send a single message to people saying, hey, it's okay, don't come to work, you're not going to get fired, we're going to take care of you, everything's good, stay home, take care of your family, take care of yourself, they could have dramatically reduced that anxiety and kept someone from having this feeling that they needed to leave and then putting themselves in a really dangerous situation.
And
thanks, Peter.
I would like to make one point. It's all about planning ahead. I really think that you can reduce the anxiety, you can reduce the fear of the unknown when it comes to winter weather by planning ahead. Take the time during the summer to make those plans, communication plans. What's going to happen if certain roads are closed? What if you're stuck at work? How are you going to be able to get home? What happens if schools close? That type of thing. All the weather offices, we're required by law to have continuity of operations plans in place, and they take into consideration the people, the service, and things. And I think it really makes a big difference if you can go into hearing a situation. From us, the weather community, we're not definitive on something. We're saying it could go one way or another, but if you have a plan in place, you feel better about how things are going to work out, even if it is at the last minute something bad does happen.
Yep.
Absolutely. Yeah, I still remember, I think it was another webinar that we were doing where somebody, it was a customer, chatted in and told us a story of a wildfire and how they had communicated with all their employees that they were in the path of a wildfire and that they should evacuate. Had nothing to do with their physical workplace or facility, but their homes were specifically in the path. And their employees were profusely thankful to their employer because they had not received an evacuation order from the local government. So I think, we're hearing more and more of these stories where customers or businesses are going above and beyond to make sure their employees are aware of events that are happening around their home location or physical workplace location. And Trish, actually one of our audience members, just chatted in. She said, when I send out alerts and follow-ups, 99% of the responses are thank you so much for checking on us. And she said we use alert media. So that's great to hear.
Yeah.
So switching topics a little bit here, there's a question that came in around La Nina. So Jason, do you anticipate that La Nina will have a generally positive or negative effect on winter weather conditions this year, this season?
Well, it depends if you like snow, rain, you like the sunshine. I mean, you like the beach. I mean, it really.
What's positive for you, I guess?
I want to go
I mean,
skiing.
if you're a ski operator, you want those blizzards. You want these, the intense snowfalls, but not all the time, because how are you going to get there? So so it really depends on what you're looking for. Again, uh, if snow and ice and flooding rains are going to be a problem, well, obviously you're not going to want to see a forecast that shows you above normal probabilities of precipitation. Or if you want a cold winter, if that's what your business does better with, then obviously what you're seeing, what Paul described down in the southern United States, isn't going to really bode too well in New Mexico and the ski resorts down there, if it's going to be a warmer winter down there. So it's hard to say, what's positive or negative, but the way it's looking right now, with this pattern we're setting up, it's looking like a warmer, a mild and a dry pattern across the southern half of the U.S. and across the northern tier states. It's going to average out on the cooler side, especially the western parts, and as well as a little wetter. The Northeast, again, it's right now it's warmer, so that trend is, once you lock into a trend, it's sometimes very hard to break out of. But it hasn't really been that dry. It's been dry in some spots and warm and wetter in others. So if the cool air and the moisture can team up together, all it takes is one storm to a 2-foot snowstorm, and you got your snowfall for the year. I mean, you're done, and that may be all that's all it takes. And it's interesting, when just one storm. I mean, it doesn't have to be a storm every week to be a bad winter. It can be one big snowstorm,
Right.
and it could be a mild winter. Look at what happened with Hurricane Andrew. It was the only hurricane in 1992, and yet it was the first one at the end of August of 1992. It was the A storm. Look how late it was, and it was a catastrophic storm in southern Florida. It only takes one nor'easter to cripple the I-95 corridor. It only takes one ice storm across central Texas to cripple I-35. Sorry. from Dallas to San Antonio. I'm sorry. I worked in the South a little too long. I'm dangerous, but but you know what I mean. So it only takes one. So even though we're calling for a dry winter, and Paul, you mentioned it. Just because we're calling for a drier winter does not mean something catastrophic could happen.
Right. I mean, these are just forecasts. I mean, these outlooks are forecasts. And I remember just a quick story. So even a couple years ago, I purposely made my ski trip out to Lake Tahoe because that was an El Nino year where typically the California gets pounded with feet and feet of snow and the Sierras and everything else. And that El Nino just didn't pan out like it was supposed to. And by the time I got out there, half the ski runs were closed because there wasn't even enough snow on the ground. So, while while the climatologists look at the trend of what has happened in the past, and that's how they come up with these outlooks of where it's going to be drier and where it's going to be warmer and cooler. There still can be the years that, yeah, it happens and the opposite will occur, or we have a month worth of flooding rain where it was supposed to be drier all winter. It just it's what keeps us having our jobs. It's that we, unfortunately, we're wrong sometimes, but we do the best we can.
There's a question that came in ahead of time, and they were curious, okay, even if there are no storms, are low temperatures enough of a reason that a business should consider closing an office or taking employees out of the field?
I'll talk to what happens here first, and then maybe Jason can chime in what happens where people are used to it getting cold. The issue that we have here, and the reason why some businesses might have to close down because of cold, is maybe not necessarily because of the cold temperatures, but actually because of the water breaks. Here, when they bury the water pipes, they don't bury it as deep as they do like in the northern states, that the ground gets so cold that the ground freezes and everything else. And so the problem we have is that, like when they build houses and everything else, sometimes there's water pipes up in the attic. Sometimes there's water pipes just a few inches buried deep into the ground. And so one of the big issues that we have when it gets, when I would say for us, cold, like below freezing for an entire day, is we have water main breaks. Water main breaks means you don't have water. So if your business can't survive without water, then maybe that would be a reason for you to close. Now, most of that I would think would be reactionary. You don't necessarily close because it's cold, but you will have to close because it got cold because the water mains broke and you didn't have any water. So, it's not unheard of that if some major cold outbreak would hit you down here, and for how people aren't prepared, they don't have the clothing, they don't have the long johns, they don't have that kind of stuff, that maybe some school districts or some businesses would be proactive. But we're obviously a little bit more susceptible to cold than, let's say, Jason is, or anywhere up in the northern tier. Jason, why don't you kind of tell you some of your stories of how cold it's gotten and what they've done up there?
Well, a lot of people know Buffalo, New York, as a very cold spot, and it's actually not really as cold as you think. It doesn't get really below zero that much, but it's cold though. I mean, it's just windy all the time, but it does get down to single digits, above and below zero. But other parts of the Northeast and the northern states get well below zero, 20, 30 below zero. Minneapolis is a big city, Chicago in those areas. But when it gets that cold, I mean, obviously people who have to work outside are susceptible to these extreme conditions. And it's again about planning ahead of time with the protective equipment for your hands, your face, your feet, your extremities, because they're the parts of your body that are going to be exposed. Also covering your nose because of the cold air that may get inside your lungs that could irritate things. But there are some jobs where you don't have a choice. Take, for instance, water main breaks. Well, some of these water pipes in some of these large, the Northeast cities, they go back 100, 150 years. I mean, they're old, and they break during the, these are public water lines, and somebody has to fix them, and the cold air is not going away. And so you can't. It's a health issue. It's a safety issue. I mean, you have to reconnect these water lines, and so somebody's got to go outside and fix it. During the a really cold outbreak. So there's that. I mean, one of the worst case scenarios you can have, in my opinion, is an ice storm. And with an ice storm, you're bringing down infrastructure that's critical to power supply. And for instance, there was an ice storm back in 1990 in Rochester, New York, and it was an extremely bad ice storm where they had no power for weeks, and it was a very cold air mass after the storm. So if you don't have power, you don't have heat, and you're talking about a whole city that is out power, or at least parts of the city were without power. So it's one of those things where, you know, you really have to uh, uh, know what to do as far as being ready for it.
Right. So to your point, so while, you know, cold temperatures may not be typically an issue, if you don't have power though, it becomes an issue. So
Right.
if those really cold temperatures come after an ice storm where the power is out, then all of a sudden, right, businesses would have to be shutting down because basically nobody has heat. And then
Right.
how do you run a business without, right? So a lot will depend on a domino effect of what weather happened and then what's going to happen as those dominoes start falling.
Yeah, I
Because
think,
I'm sorry, just one more point is what happens is then the supply chains
right.
start collapsing, and then your food supply goes away, your gasoline supply, then you start getting it starts the domino effect starts kicking in. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you there.
No, that's exactly what I was going to say. It's a domino effect. It's the supply chain. I was up in, gosh, I think this was 7 or 8 years ago in Minnesota when they had what was unusually low temperatures in the -40s. And I had flown up for a business trip and they shut down schools. And I'm like, really? You guys do that up here? It gets so cold. Aren't you used to it? And they said they don't want kids hanging out at bus stops waiting for buses. And so then all schools were shut down, which threw everyone out of, you know, no one was expecting that. And then people were scrambling, trying to figure out what do I do with my kids today? So yeah, it's that domino effect that you really have to think about when low temperatures are coming.
Yeah, so to answer the question, it's about the extremity, you know, how extreme is the event? The extreme event for Texas is different than an extreme event up in Minnesota. So it's all relative about
Right.
where you live and what is considered, I would say, you know, what's extreme.
Right, absolutely. And I forgot to mention this earlier, but we have, you know, a couple hundred safety leaders on this call. So if you have examples that you want to chat in that you'd like to share with the audience and your experience, go ahead and chat them in as we're answering these questions, and I'll pull any relevant ones up and share them with the group because I think that would be helpful for people to hear from our audience as well. Okay, so a question about COVID-19 came in. Peter, what do you suggest on the frequency of mass notifications regarding COVID-19? I don't want my alerts to lose their value.
Yeah, I would say that there's really two issues at play here. There are the general COVID communications that you should be doing, and then the exposure specific ones out there. I think you told me there was another question around the specific stuff, so we'll hold off on that. And from a general COVID-19 communications perspective, I think it's largely dependent on the type of people in your workforce. So people working from home probably require less frequent communication compared to those who are coming into a facility. Those that are just working from home, they really just need to know the general expectations and timeline around reopening. I mean, that's pretty much it. They can do their jobs at home, but they're curious, like what's going on? When can I go back to the office? Do I need to start thinking about that, planning more daycare or childcare, whatever that is? They just need to be able to start preparing. Those who are already coming on site need to know a lot more. Like, are there any changes to rules or procedures? Has the local government changed something? Has the company changed procedures? When I drive into the parking lot today, do I have to get tested somewhere or go through a certain tent? So there's a lot more communication that they're going to need to get. And of course, there's the whole thing about exposures, right? You got to make sure you notify people about that. So I would say, as with any notification that you send, if it's for COVID-19 or anything, just think about the audience and then target your messages and then the frequency according to the need. Don't treat everyone the same. I think that's the biggest thing that we see where failure starts to creep into your notification program is when you treat everybody the same. I would say that over communication only results in a general fatigue among people when the notifications are inappropriate for the recipient.
Yeah, and Peter, we're seeing a lot of legislation coming out of some of the states around this, right? There's Assembly Bill 685 in California, and there's a couple other states that are putting legislation out around COVID communications. So I think people are starting to get more and more used to receiving frequent communication around COVID-19, especially as these things are legislated. They want to be aware of new information as you're aware of that information.
Yeah.
Another question about the current pandemic, especially as we're heading into winter, and seasonal affective disorder is a real thing that employees are usually faced with in the winter. And now we are seeing the intersection of both of those things coming up here. So how do you deal with the increased feeling of disconnectedness caused by remote working due to the pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, this is a tough one, and I've had a couple guests on the Employee Safety Podcast, which I host, that we've talked about this, and it's tough because we've just never seen such a sustained separation of people from the office, and all people react differently to those types of things. So there is no one answer, but I would say the best practices we've seen so far is to obviously communicate regularly about what's going on just in general, as far as COVID-19 and how it's impacting the organization and people's ability to return to work. Another big thing that I learned in some of these interviews I did was have managers talk to their people on a regular basis, specifically about how they're dealing with the pandemic and if they need any help. In the past, you may have put those conversations off, like, you know, kind of a weekly or monthly one-on-one. You need to make sure that you do that now. It's super critical because so many people react differently. You just need to talk to them. And I don't think you need to be an expert or anything like that. You don't need to be a therapist. Just listen. And people need to know they're being listened to. Acknowledge when they say that they've got an issue and what their challenges are. Just acknowledge that. And then run off and go to HR and figure out, okay, here's what I learned. What can we do to help this person out and get them what they need? Now, a few other things you can do are things we've done here at Alert Media, which is organize like team-based web happy hours, or a great thing we've done is just randomly assign people once a month to have like 15-minute one-on-one conversations with a random other person in the company they might not normally otherwise speak with. It's pretty interesting, the engagements you get there, and then have people post that into like an in-house chat tool where people can say, hey, here's a screenshot of us talking and it was a great conversation, and maybe just recap what they talked about or something like that. But I would say, look, there's no like single right or final answer here. Just get creative and try things. This is new for all of us.
Yeah, and Peter, you mentioned, oh, go ahead, Jason.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'd like to echo, you know, what Peter said, you know, because the National Weather Service has 122 weather forecast offices across the country, and you know, we're not robots, we're humans, and you know, we're facing the same problem. You know, if you know, when it first started back in March and April, it was up here in New Jersey and New York area. We tended to be the hot spot, and you know, my office, we were concerned, you know, what's going to happen if you know, all of a sudden half my office is quarantined. But now it seems like it's everywhere, and so the problem that the agency is coming up or is battling here is what's going to happen if half the weather offices have to be quarantined. Who's going to do the tornado warnings? Who's going to do the hurricane warnings? You know, what if the National Hurricane Center is quarantined? You know, what's going to happen now with we have Eta out there and we have Theta that's out in the middle of the Atlantic. Who's going to take care of that? You know, and we have a storm prediction center in Kansas City. What's going to happen if they get quarantined? Who's going to issue? You know, it just snowballs. So it's very concerning, very concerning.
Yeah.
Yeah, we did as Peter mentioned, there's been quite a bit of content that we've been putting out on this topic. So we'll share in the chat in a few minutes a link to the podcast episode that Peter mentioned, but we also did a similar conversation with an expert webinar. And I remember during that webinar, somebody chatted in and said one of the things they were doing is just sending wellness checks through Alert Media, through their tool, and just checking in on employees at a certain cadence just to understand, you know, how are people doing, how are they feeling, and getting responses back. So that's another thing that we've seen a lot of is just wellness surveys and general wellness checks.
I'm just going to take notes down of the virtual happy hour. I like that.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, Jason and Paul, what can businesses do ahead of time to make their organization resilient when a storm does come?
So, you know, one thing that we've talked about in multiple different webinars and everything else is practicing and planning, like Jason had mentioned earlier. From the Weather Service side of things, you know, we deal a lot with cities and counties and some private businesses, but mainly cities and counties. And the tabletop exercises, the going through the plans, making sure that every, you know, I is dotted, T's are crossed on phone numbers that are accurate, the partners that are going to be responding, that if they have to open up shelters, all of that. So it all has to do with the planning of, you know, knowing what threats you have. What are the threats to your business, and particularly, is it icy roads? Is it the actual cold? Is it the amount of snow? Is it Are people not going to show up to your restaurant anymore? I mean, it's, you know, if it's snow and cold, I mean, so you have to kind of know what's going to be affecting your business first, and then you're going to have to, you know, run up with those scenarios and practice those scenarios. What are, you know, does the business have a backup generator? You know, so you can be the only so you can be the only business that's operating when everybody else is shut down, right? I mean, you know, you obviously want to stand out in some of those things. I used to kind of talk about a couple of different scenarios, like, you know, think about these big businesses, you know, these box stores and stuff, and if you know a big winter storm is coming, you know they are going to be running out of shovels and salt and all these other kind of things. So, you know, practicing your plan of action, that if the storm is coming, you know, we need to order more of these things, because, you know, you're going to sell out and everybody's going to be wanting that sort of information too. So from my standpoint, it's all about practicing and being part of those drills and tabletop exercises and going through the process before it actually hits. Like Jason has said, you know, these are things you do in the summertime, and in the fall, you're already planning and practicing for the wintertime sort of events. You have to be doing it that far in advance so you can make adjustments to your plans, fix things that you found, and then go forward so you're totally prepared when that actual winter storm actually hits.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, exactly. It's all about planning. You can't. I mean, that's it. Just exactly what Paul said. You can't. I don't think you can plan enough. I mean, there's never, you know, a small amount of planning you can do. There's just, you just got to keep doing exercises, practice, and that's how you get better. We work with the city of Philadelphia. Our office has a really close relationship with the city, and there's a lot of things that we do with them. There's a lot of different situations in the wintertime, and you know, different businesses. I'm sure. I think I agree that they should do the same thing.
Yeah, the one thing that we don't want to happen is that, you know, as an example, like for that forecast that we showed, right, the whole southern half of the United States is warmer and drier. Oh, okay, well, it's probably not going to be that bad, so I guess we don't have to, you know, order as much salt. Maybe not have to order, you know, this and that, and like, you know, Jason had the example of Hurricane Andrew, right? So that was a record low year for tropical systems. Now, you know, when we come out with a forecast of how many tropical systems we think is going to happen, I'm hoping that planners at businesses and cities and counties aren't looking at those raw numbers and going, ooh, okay, we can take a breath this year because, you know, it's pretty much guaranteed that nothing's going to happen. Well, no, that's not how you read those forecasts. It only takes one. We say it a lot when the hurricane season, it only takes one. And then Jason mentioned that too. It only takes one big, massive nor'easter to hit the Northeast for your whole budget to be shot with all your winter preparedness, right? I mean, so you have to almost, I would say you have to prepare more every year. I mean, it's whatever you did last year, you have to prepare a little bit more. And whatever you did that year, you have to prepare a little bit more from that. And you build on with that preparedness.
And I think when you consider just a particular storm in general, a great piece of advice I've heard is always to plan for one category worse than what's actually predicted.
Yes, right. Yeah, we use a term now, especially when we talk to emergency managers, a reasonable worst case scenario is what we call it. And that's their planning edge. We give them what we think is going to be happening, but they want to know, like in hurricanes, like you said, Peter, you know, one category, you know, up. Well, in a winter storm, what does that mean? Well, maybe that means, you know, worst case scenario is instead of 6 inches, we're getting 12. And that's a big difference between, I think it is, between 6 inches and 12 inches. I don't, you know, 2 inches for me here in Texas is a lot of snow. So, but you know, that's the difference between being able to somewhat drive and probably get to places. A foot of snow, I don't know, you know, that's depends on how quick the plows can get out and get those roads clear and everything else. So there's those little areas where now it goes from bad to worse. And a lot of the planners, especially when the cities and counties come in, they want to know what that small possibility is, because they need to have all the infrastructure, they need to have people staged, they need to have the plan available, that in case, yes, the weather service or the weather forecasters are wrong and we get it a little bit off, that, you know, they're not totally then shut down because they were planning for a worse scenario.
Yep.
So one of the next questions that an audience member submitted is what tool is available for employees to be able to review weather and other threats at their leisure through a mobile app, question mark. I don't know, Peter, if this is an opportunity for you just to speak about the Alert Media tool and how we can help in this area.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, clearly, there's lots of different tools out there that you can get. I mean, there's a tremendous number of apps that focus just specifically on weather. And look, here's what I always say is that just getting a stream of information is valuable, but it's much more valuable if you can place context on it. And the context when it comes to a company is, do I have any locations or people that might be in harm's way? And if you can put two and two together very quickly, it becomes exponentially more valuable, because that's what you need to focus on. So in the Alert Media app itself, in our platform, you're able to do those two things. You can see where all your physical locations are, where your people live, where your travelers are, things like that, and then overlay that weather information on top of it, and then get automated updates anytime your people or locations happen to fall in harm's way. So it dramatically reduces the time that you have to spend trying to assess this information manually, and then the amount of time it takes for you to know that something's coming. Like Paul said earlier, weather changes very quickly. You look at the forecast and like 30 minutes later, it's totally different. I went out for a jog this morning, it was 75. I went out right before this session we're having, and it was 60. And that was just not very much time passed. So make sure you can automate it. I think that's really critical.
Yeah.
Thanks, Peter. And I have a final poll here. So if you are interested in learning more about Alert Media's emergency communication software and some of the threat monitoring capabilities that Peter just mentioned, you can fill out this poll and then we'll follow up with you after today's presentation. We do have quite a few more questions, so we'll stay on for a few minutes after the hour here. If you can stay on with us and you want your question answered, we will try and get to as many as we can here today. And then if we don't get to your question, we're going to share Peter, Paul, and Jason's contact information so that you can feel free to follow up with them after. And then this presentation and recording will also be available after today's presentation. It should be available starting tomorrow from Continuity Insights. Okay. While there's still some people filling that out, so I'll just go ahead and let people continue to fill it out. And I will ask another question. Peter and Paul, Jason, I think all of you could probably chime in here on this one. What are some of the best practices for returning to work after a severe weather event?
Paul, Jason, you want to take a stab first? Do you want me to say something?
I was nervous that I lost everyone.
The one thing I guess I'll say is make safety comes first. So whenever we're talking about, especially down here, no matter what kind of storm, we're obviously talking about winter storms, but same thing goes with hurricanes and ice storms and severe weather and tornadoes and everything else. Making sure that the roads are even clear, especially even with flooding. You don't want to leave and get out there too quickly before crews have been able to remove power lines, clear the roads, maybe infrastructure was damaged, some bridges, who knows, whatever weather event it actually was. So obviously use caution, and that's where the communication obviously with your employer is going to be key, because hopefully whoever is in charge of you at your business, they've done that homework and they already know that the roads are clear. The city and county have made it clear that okay, infrastructure is back up, the power is back up, and everything else.
I would add to that you definitely want to find out how your people are doing. Are they able to return to work or not? Do they need more time off? And then based on what Paul said, and then that, I would say communicate very clear expectations to your employees. Again, anytime you have a situation where it's not normal, there's confusion and people don't know what to do. Anxiety goes up, stress level goes up, productivity goes down. The best thing you can do as an employer is to just communicate, establish expectations, and then people will have a better sense of what to do. And it's okay if I can't get to work. My employer is not going to fire me.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to throw one at you that I hope everyone's okay answering, because I'm not sure the answer. Polar vortex seems to be a relatively new term, at least for us non-meteorologists. Can you speak to this and please explain the cause?
Go for it, Paul.
Oh, lovely.
Make the guy in the South explain it.
Yeah. You pick the guy in Texas to explain polar vortex. Fail. So very, very briefly, so it seems like every year there's a new key word in weather that becomes popular to use. And a couple years back, yeah, polar vortex was the key phrase. And that was a winter where we had a lot of cold snaps. It's nothing new in science. They've known about it. Big low pressure area up in the Arctic region that is up there all during the winter, and occasionally it'll push down those really, really cold Arctic air masses. So it sounds like a fancy term, but most of you that are listening probably have heard of low pressure and high pressure areas. If you watch TV and you watch the TV meteorologists talking about that kind of stuff, it's basically that's what it is, but it's over the Arctic region, and it sits there pretty much all winter time, and that's what kind of spokes through and brings down some of these cold outbreaks that we have in the United States, especially up in the Great Lakes and the Northeast and everything, and occasionally down in Texas. They're pretty infrequent down here, luckily.
So to ask you a question that you could have done a whole separate presentation on?
Not me, no. That was about as much as I know about polar vortex.
Good to know.
You did a good job, Paul. Good job, Paul.
I appreciate it. It sounds pretty much accurate. I'm hoping it was fairly accurate.
Okay, another COVID-related question, not necessarily having much to do about winter weather, but when and how should employers notify employees when there has been an exposure risk to COVID-19 at the office? I think we touched on this a little bit, Peter, but maybe if you could speak more directly to that question.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say that there's the legal answer, and then there's the what's the right thing to do answer. And clearly, I'm not an attorney, so I can't give the legal answer. But it really differs from state to state and sometimes county to county. So please check with your local state and county authorities to understand what regulations you are required to follow. For example, Alex, you mentioned this before, but California recently released the bill AB 685, which basically says you have one business day after learning of an infection to notify any potentially exposed individuals. You also have to maintain records of that communication for 3 years. It's very specific. So please check what your state and county is requiring. But I would say regardless of the specific requirements, it's critical to be able to do 3 things as you contemplate making these communications. One, you want to deliver the messages via multiple channels because you don't know which of your employees prefers one method over another or even has some methods over others. So you need to make sure you can reach them across multiple channels to get the message to them quickly. Second, you want to obtain confirmation of receipt, basically, so you know they actually got it and read it, and you get that on record. And then that goes to the third point, which is to preserve the evidence of the communication. Those are 3 critical things: deliver it on multiple channels, obtain confirmation of receipt, and then preserve the evidence in the future in case you get sued or you're requested by authorities to show that.
Thanks, Peter. That's some great actionable advice for our audience. Dawn, that was our last question that I was going to get to today. I know that you have a slide that we gave you with everyone's contact information. If you could share that with the audience, that'd be great. So yes, as I mentioned, the contact information should be here for you to see. We will be sharing it after today's presentation along with the recording. So you'll have it to be able to share within your organization or watch certain parts again if you need a refresher. And I just want to thank our speakers today and our expert guests, Paul, Jason, and Peter. Thank you so much for being here. And thank you so much to Continuity Insights for hosting us today. And if you'd like to learn more about Alert Media, we'll send you a follow-up email with some resources after today. You can simply reply to that. Thank you everyone for joining us. It was a great discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.